This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. It's been a little bit since I've done one of these. COVID took me out of commission for a while, and then I had to get caught up on all the top 10s and stuff. But now that we've got a brand new set getting ready to come out in the form of Aetherdrift, it's time to start really diving into limited. We are in the first week of preview season. It concludes next week, which means my set review, where I'll look at every card in the set, starts next Friday. And if you are a patron or a channel member, you can get access to sort of my rough draft for the set review, my notes as new cards are previewed, and you can find ways to be a channel member or a patron in the description to this video. But in this particular video, we're going to look at what we know so far, like usual in this first look video. We know what all of the big mechanics in the set are, and we know what the archetypes are, more or less. We don't have a signpost uncommon for every color pair, but I think we've got 8 of them covered, and the other 2 are pretty obvious. So we'll be diving into that. I'll give you my first thoughts on how I think these things will play out. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. The big headliner mechanic, and we'll start with mechanics, is start your engines /speed /max speed. These are all interconnected mechanics that are all about doing the same thing. So if you have a card that says start your engines, that means if you have no speed, it starts at 1, and it can increase once on each of your turns when an opponent loses life, and max speed is 4. So this, importantly, is a mechanic that is tracked sort of separate from cards themselves. It's kind of like the One Ring, where if you make progress with this, that progress lasts, even if your start your engines card disappears or whatever. You start tracking your speed anytime you have a card that has start your engines, and thereafter, once during each of your turns, when an opponent loses life, you increase your speed. And this has a little handy card that you can use to track your speed, and for the most part, there are a few exceptions, your speed doesn't really matter until it's at max speed, which is 4. You can see that on Avishkar Raceway here. There's a bunch of cards in this format that have start your engines that gain an additional effect or become a better card once you're at max speed. So this Raceway, for example, lets you start paying 3 generic and tapping it to discard a card and draw a card. This card in particular, I don't think is that good, but it will be interesting to see. There is one color pair that's really into this, black-red, but every color pair has start your engine stuff, and it'll be interesting to see if a card that starts tracking your speed on turn 1, like Avishkar Raceway, is better than you expect, because this card, like, its big payoff for start your engines isn't particularly good. You know, it's a late game ability that you can access to help you dig through your deck, and there are some payoffs for discarding in the format, but it's expensive, you're not going to have time to use that ability, and this damages your mana base. But what I'm saying is, I could see a world where just being able to play a land that does start your engines is good, because it gets it going as early as possible, and the earlier you get it going, the more likely you are to get to max speed. I do think this will be kind of hard to evaluate overall. Like, a lot of the cards with max speed, they also help you get max speed in a sense. Like, let's look at Streaking Oil Gorger, for example. It is 5 mana 3/3 flying haste, and it has start your engines, and it has max speed and it gains lifelink. So the fact that it has flying and haste makes it reasonably likely it'll get in for a hit, and even if you had no speed at all at that point, you will now be at speed 2, and the next turn you'll be to 3, and so on. And if you already have max speed, well, this already comes with the keyword. So what's going to be interesting is seeing how easy it is to get to max speed, because there are a lot of cards that if they can't access their max speed effect consistently, they just don't look very good. And like Streaking Oil Gorger is sort of one of those cards. A 5 mana 3/3 flyer is inefficient enough that it dies to like 2 mana removal at lower rarities, and that is always kind of a problem. But if it has lifelink, it's more likely to do something immediately in the sense of, you know, creating a life gap between you and your opponent, and that's much better than just getting in for 3 is. I'm sort of fascinated to see how this mechanic plays out. It does kind of indicate that they want this to be an aggressive format, because so many cards have start your engines and max speed effects. And there are lots of cards designed with the purpose of helping you more easily reach max speed. So they want us to be doing this. That's why I say it's the headliner mechanic. It's across everything in the set. It's not just in one color pair or something. So yeah, I'm fascinated to see how it plays out. My initial instinct is that I think max speed will be doable. But I also don't think you should look at a card and count on having max speed. When you're evaluating these cards that have max speed that aren't very good without it, there's a 2-mana 0/4 rare that gives you no maximum hand size. That's a bad card. But you start drawing extra cards anytime you draw a card if you have max speed. So when you're looking at a card like that is all or nothing, where it's terrible if you don't have max speed and really good when you do, you have to account for the times when you don't have it going. And those are going to happen. Another problem with the mechanic that worries me a little bit is it does seem kind of like a win more mechanic. It seems like a snowbally mechanic where it's hey, I'm already ahead, so I'm going to get to max speed, and because of that, I now have an even greater advantage in this race. That worries me a little bit. You could say on the flip side that both players can sort of be making decisions, especially if they're both trying to reach max speed, where you do have to be more defensive because you don't want your opponent to get to max speed and unlock the full potential of their cards, but the snowbally nature of it worries me a little bit too. But we'll see how it plays out. It's definitely interesting and hard to really get a feel for without playing it, more than most mechanics are, I think. The other new mechanic in the set, although it is actually something we've seen before, they just gave it a word, is Exhaust. Basically, this ability means you can only use this ability once, period. So, not once per turn, once ever. Your card gets, exhausted when you use it, or that ability does anyway. I actually really like this mechanic. It's been interesting on the few random cards we've seen it on recently, where it seemed like they were sort of testing it out. But I think it makes activated abilities more interesting. You can make much better activated abilities when you can only use them once. And it makes for interesting balanced cards that have these interesting decision points. The example I want to show you is Prowcatcher Specialist, this 2-mana 2/1 haste goblin. Not an amazing card. But later in the game, you can pay 4 and put 2 counters on it, and then it becomes a much more reasonable card. Obviously, the total mana you spend here isn't great, but it does mean this is relevant on turn 2 and relevant on turn 4 in most cases, and if you draw it late, it's sort of like it has kicker for 4, and you can just attack with it right away as a 4/3. And obviously, if you could use that ability more than once, it would be really good. There's also the really cool rare Loot the Pathfinder, which has 3 exhaust abilities, which is pretty cool. One of them is basically Ancestral Recall, one is Lightning Bolt. I'm not really sure why they made the third one not Giant Growth, because that's the cycle. Instead, it's a green ritual, which is interesting. They must have decided that the +3/+3 was better somehow. But those abilities are all really good, and if you could use them more than once, it'd be completely absurd. So I like Exhaust a fair bit, and there are a couple of color pairs that are really interested in it. This is also a good kind of mechanic. You could sort of look at it like Disguise or Morph, where, those are things you can only use once, but they give you something to do with your mana to turn your creature face up, or in this case, activate an ability. Makes it pretty easy to have stuff to do with your mana when you have cards with activated abilities, and there are more than normal in this set because of Exhaust. So the last returning mechanic that isn't one we've seen a bunch, Cycling is in this set at this point. It's an evergreen mechanic. And then, as they've done lately, there are mechanics that show up on 1 or 2 cards here or there, like Exert on Bosri and stuff, but that's just what they do now. Those aren't big mechanics that have a big impact on the set. But there is one returning mechanic that we've only seen once before that I think it's worth mentioning, and that is Saddle. So, this isn't only a vehicle set. There are also mounts. They decided to mix it up there. And the thing to remember that makes creatures with Saddle, which we saw for the first time in Thunder Junction, different from vehicles, is that they are always creatures, and they can still attack or block even if they're not saddled. Saddling has a similar, you pay for it similarly, and this set has a bunch of cards where if you use that creature to saddle or crew a vehicle, you get some sort of bonus, so the effect is similar, but it just gives you a bonus. It doesn't it doesn't keep your creature from being a creature, which if you didn't play during Thunder Junction, you might think of it more like crew than it is, but it's not. An example of this is Autarch Mammoth, a 6-mana 5/5 that when it enters and whenever it attacks while saddled, you create a 3/3 green elephant creature token. It's also got Saddle 5. This card just looks great in general. You'd already play 6 mana for 5/5 and a 3/3 like every day of the week. Like, that's just a really good rate. But you can also use that 3/3 plus something else to help you saddle this to make another 3/3. So, yeah, it's a really good card, but, you know, this is just an example of how it works. Some of them get stats boosts. Some of them get attacks triggers. Some of them become indestructible. Like, that's how it works. They become better when you can saddle them, but saddling is similar to crewing in that you have to tap any number of creatures with total power equal to the saddle number or greater, and you can only do it as a sorcery. So, yeah, we don't have that many mechanics in this set as big mechanics. We've got those 2 new ones in Exhaust and Max Speed, and then we've got the return of Saddle. All right, so let's move into each of the color pairs and what's going on here. You know, in the story, there are these 10 different teams who are taking part in this death race to win the Ether Spark, this big prize. And each of these teams is represented by a color pair. These teams are from all over the multiverse and stuff too, because that's how Magic is now. And this race takes place across 3 different planes because people can travel between planes now. So there's a lot of variety here in some ways in what each of these color pairs is about. But one big recurring theme is we've got, you know, we're very into vehicles, we're very into mounts, and we're into artifacts. You know, those are sort of overlapping themes. Some color pairs are into it more, but, you know, for example, every color pair has 2 signpost uncommons, and one of them at least is a vehicle. So every color pair has a gold vehicle, and that's what we're going to look at mostly here. We've only seen the second signpost uncommon for a couple of other cards at this point in preview season, but, which, by the way, that means the set has 2 signpost uncommons per color pair, which is not always how it goes. Usually it makes formats more synergistic when you have that going on. So yeah, let's look at each of these different color pairs and see what it is exactly they want you to be doing, and take a look at their vehicle signpost uncommon. So blue-white is Guidelight, the Guidelight Voyagers, and their signpost uncommon is Guidelight Pathmaker. So it's a 6 mana, 6/5 with Vigilance, and when it enters, you tutor up an artifact card and reveal it. So you're into artifacts more broadly here, and not just into vehicles. And you can put it onto the battlefield if its mana value is 2 or less. Otherwise, put it into your hand and then shuffle as crew 2. So, yeah, I mean, this is, in terms of, like, being an efficient vehicle, you expect better stats than this when you pay this much for a vehicle, since they're conditional creatures. However, this is really strong because tutors you up an artifact, and if you're really in a pinch, you can just grab something you get to put on the battlefield most of the time. So blue-white is an artifact deck, not just a vehicle deck or something like that, but artifacts specifically. Vehicles are artifacts, so that, of course, works out nicely. But yeah, the Pathmaker is just a really good tutor, and it has a not irrelevant body, so it looks like a good signpost to me, and obviously, you know, an artifact theme seems really well seated throughout this format. So this looks pretty solid to me. So for black-red, it's a team called the End Riders, and they are the color pair that's really into getting to max speed. The vehicle we have isn't super obvious about that in the way some other things are. Like, it doesn't actually say speed or max speed anywhere on it. But this vehicle, Apocalypse Runner, is a 4 mana 6/5, and you can tap it to make a smaller creature be unblockable and gain lifelink until end of turn. So it helps you get to speed by max speed by letting you make things unblockable. Also, that ability is just like pretty good. Like, if you can send in an unblockable 2/2 every turn, like the amount of life deficit between you and your opponent just rapidly increases. You know, having to tap this thing that's a 6/5 that could be attacking isn't always going to be ideal. But if you're both trying to get to max speed and just like trying to gain some life, feels pretty good overall. Like I said already, you know, there are some things that worry me about max speed, whether or not you'll be able to consistently get there. And then there's the question of, like, if I'm really trying to get max speed, maybe I'd rather just have a 4 mana 4/4 creature than Apocalypse Runner. Like, you know what I mean? So cards that, like, are this finicky about how they work and what they do worry me a little bit. So this signpost uncommon is one that I feel a little iffy about. For red-green, we've got the Goblin Rocketeers, and their signpost uncommon is the Rocketeer Boost Buggy. So this is a 2 mana 3/2 vehicle, and whenever it attacks, you make a treasure. and it has exhaust. So this is one of the color pairs that's into exhaust. It's like an exhaust ramp deck. You know, you do get treasure here, right? And in this case, this vehicle becomes an artifact creature, period. So it becomes one all the time. You don't have to crew it anymore, and you put a counter on it. So this looks pretty good to me. You know, it'd be way better if it made the treasure when it enters. Like, that would be awesome, right? You get 2 artifacts, 2 pieces of material no matter what. It does have to attack to give you that first treasure, which is something. But, it, you know, especially if you play it on 2 and it's only got crew 1, your chances of doing that are pretty good. And it's also got an exhaust ability that you can just pay for on your next turn. Like, you know, it's not the most exciting thing in the world to spend, you know, 3 on your next turn to make it into a 4/3 creature, but it's a vehicle that has that upside. And then it can also just make treasure, which it can still get even once it's always a vehicle, right? Always a creature, rather, because it'll give you that treasure. So, you know, this one looks pretty good to me. It's just, like, decent value. The moment where you you crew it and your opponent like kills it with a shock effect for 1 mana, it doesn't feel great, but at least it only costs 2, so it's not completely backbreaking. And if you have 3 mana up, that won't work. So yeah, this one looked pretty good to me overall, especially because it's supporting exhaust stuff by giving you treasure. All right, so green-white is the Alacrian Quick Beasts, and they're really into mounts more so than vehicles. I said earlier all the signposts are vehicles. Not quite all of them. There are, this might be the only mount, but there might be one other one too. Yeah, so you're more into mounts than you're into vehicles, but they did, luckily, make sure that these cards that are payoffs for vehicles are also payoff for mounts and vice versa, so that you don't have this weird thing going on where some of your mounts and vehicles are helped by payoffs and some of them are able to give buffs to things and some of them aren't. Pretty much, I think everything we've seen so far, all the payoffs say mounts/vehicles, right? So, and Lagarin looks pretty good. I don't love that it starts as a 2-mana 1/1, but its attack trigger is nuts. Attacks while saddled trigger, because it puts a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target mounts and or vehicles. It can put the counter on itself, so it's always going to have something to put 1 counter on. Ideally, your deck has a bunch of other mounts and or vehicles in it, and you can consistently get 2 counters out of it when you saddle it, and it's very easy to saddle. You know, Saddle 1 and Crew 1 are both so easy to do that, like, any card that has them, you know, they usually perform. Like, it's just so much easier to have 1 power than it is to have 2 or 3 or whatever. Like, it's just way better than Saddle 2 is to have Saddle 1. Creature tokens, although a lot of the tokens in this set are pilots who can crew way above their weight class, but point being here that, you know, you want to be an aggro deck. There's also a +1/+1 counter theme here, which Lagarin's not a payoff for them, but there are a few of them in green-white. But yeah, it's mostly like a mount and vehicle aggro deck. Next, there is the Aether Rangers, who are represented by blue-green, and they are into exhaust. Their signpost uncommon is Ranger's Aether Hive. 3 mana, 3/5 vigilance vehicle with crew 1. Like I was just saying, it's really easy to crew something with crew 1, and this can rumble and defend really effectively thanks to vigilance and its stat line. But it has this really great ability too, where whenever you activate an exhaust ability, you make a 1/1 Thopter creature token with flying. You know, tacking that on to all of these exhaust abilities is like really wonderful. That's a big deal. You know, 1/1 flyer, especially that's an artifact in a set where that matters. Those are really valuable tokens. Just getting 1 with this is going to feel great. And, you know, getting more than 1 is even better. It is true that you can only do it so many times, mostly. There is 1 green uncommon that lets you exhaust as many times as you want, which will feel pretty busted with this, obviously. But most of the time, you're only going to be able to exhaust once ever. But still, those abilities generally are like nice places to stick your mana. Some of them are really powerful, especially on higher rarity cards. And just getting a Thopter out of it is good, especially when the baseline is this pretty beefy vehicle. Blue-red is the Keel Haulers. They're into discard, and their signpost is Boosted Sloop. It's 3 mana for a 3/3 with Menace. Whenever you attack, you draw a card, then discard a card. Another one with Crew 1. So I made a video short about this, sort of talking about how it compares to Smuggler's Copter. It's actually really similar. It's harder to cast, and it has Menace instead of flying. Those are big deals, obviously. Like, that makes the card substantially worse. But there is one way it's better, and that is that this loots no matter what you attack with. So the turn you play this, you tag with your 2-drop, you get to loot. So, and looting is inherently good, like especially in limited, where it drastically improves your draws. But then blue-red has lots of payoffs for discarding cards. So you're going to get even more mileage out of a vehicle like this one than it looks at first. And, 3/3 Menace that with Crew 1, it's going to be able to get sent in on a lot of boards too pretty effectively. And I think it'll be sneaky strong. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be pretty good in blue-red decks. And then red-white is Cloudspire, and their signpost vehicle is Cloudspire Sky Cycle. So 4 mana, 2/3 flying, Crew 1. So this is definitely like the worst vehicle we've seen so far in terms of like efficiency and stuff like that. But one way to make these vehicles good, and it's what they did with a lot of them, is give them interest triggers. So even if they're not adding to the board, they give you some kind of value. And in this case, you get to put 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 other target vehicles and or creatures you control. This actually doesn't say anything about mounts, but mounts are creatures, so it can put the counters there. So this color pair, it's kind of it's similar to green-white, but green-white is more into mounts. Red-white is more into vehicles. That's sort of the big difference between the two. It's always safe to assume red-white will be more aggressive, green-white will be more mid-rangey. But obviously the two are both kind of into counters and kind of into vehicles and or mount. All right, so the remaining color pairs, which are blue-black, black-white, and black-green. Those three we don't have one signpost uncommon for as I'm recording this. I waited as long as I could. It's like 1 p.m. on Friday, and I have to edit this and get it, together for tomorrow. I was surprised we didn't see all of them. Usually if we see this many, we see all of them, but we didn't. However, we do know like what the archetype is, and there is a rare for each of those color pairs that helps drive the point home. For example, blue-black, we've got Winter Cursed Rider. He's into artifacts, but he's into artifacts in the graveyard. Safe to assume that's what blue-black wants. He's got an exhaust ability that lets you exile artifacts from your graveyard, and then all non-artifact creatures get -X/-X until end of turn, screaming pretty loudly about liking artifacts and liking the graveyard there. Also gives ward to your other artifacts. So, it's going to be like a more controlling graveyard artifact deck as opposed to like blue-white, which is probably like a tempo flyers artifact deck. So then we've got black-green, where we've got a rare called Achik Emerald Radian. She likes it when artifacts or creatures are in your graveyard. So it's kind of like, we've seen effects before that check for creatures in graveyard. This tacks on artifacts, so it works better in the set. And obviously she's pretty strong. She's a rare. She makes a 1/1 insect token for each artifact and or creature card in your graveyard, and likes other insects and stuff too. But I think it's safe to assume black-green is like a self-mill artifact. Get artifacts and creatures in your graveyard as much as you can and get a bunch of value out of them. Then lastly, for black-white, we have Zahur Glory's Past. He is into speed and to start your engines. And then he has this powerful, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you make a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token. That's like his max speed effect. But I don't really think black-white is like all in on max speed, if I had to guess. I think mostly what we have here is a sacrifice deck. He's got a free sacrifice ability. You can only use it once a turn, but that's always a pretty good sign. Lets you sack another creature to surveil 1. Obviously, if you have max speed, you're getting a 2/2 when you do that, which is pretty great. But there are a bunch of expendable sacrificey things in black and white. Like, anytime there's a 1 mana 1/1 that when it dies makes a 1/1, pretty good chance you got a sacrifice deck in the format. And I think this time around it's going to be black-white. Those last three, they're not like ironclad. We haven't seen signpost uncommons exactly. But based on what the set looks like so far and what these rares look like, I'm fairly confident in what those three archetypes are going to be. And they all look, pretty good to me. Sometimes you just get duds for signpost uncommons and it's hard to tell. But, graveyard value that turns into bodies on board or into removal and stuff like that, is going to be good in a lot of limited formats. Will this one be crazy fast because of all the speed stuff? I don't know. That might make those decks a little bit worse. But yeah, overall set looks cool to me. I think they did a good job of, giving you all of these different racing teams, but they all have very different flavor when you get down to it in terms of what their color pairs do. And yeah, I'm interested in playing the set. And yeah, I think the most interesting thing to me will be how does max speed play out and start your engines and all of that. Alright, so that'll do it for this video. We took a look at the mechanics, my early thoughts on all of the different color pairs and archetypes. The set review does start next Friday, so we'll be looking at every card in the set, and there's also going to be an early access event now. That'll be coming on February 5th, and that's also when you can expect to see my first draft videos of the format. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.